Hello. Hello, everyone. I believe that we can start, but as I can see, it seems that we lost two panelists. No. Likhita, no. One, yeah. Okay, so now I think everyone is online and also here in Punta del Este. So hello, everyone. My name is Renaud Villaine. I work for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we are very pleased to organize this parallel session to the World Press Freedom Day conference jointly with Amnesty International. We are very pleased, and I think we believe that it is really critical to have such a parallel session on digital surveillance technologies, because this is the theme of this year World Press Freedom Day, but because, as you know, there are so many reports about the use of such technologies against journalists. Last year, we had the results of the Pegasus project, but also some reports about the use of Pegasus in Latin American countries, including El Salvador. And we had more recently the Catalan Gate, which was denounced, among others, by Amnesty International. So this is really timely to have this session. And this is timely, and as you know, the High Commissioner for Human Rights repeated during this World Day press conference her call for a moratorium on the use, transfer, and sale and servicing of digital technologies. And really this event is a means for us to reflect on this call for a moratorium, but also to explore other pathways for accountability for journalists whose rights have been violated by putting them under surveillance. So I will introduce the panelists. So we have online Likhita Barneji, who works as researcher and advisor for Amnesty International Technology and Human Rights Program. We have also Ángela Alarcón, who is the campaigner for Latin America and the Caribbean at Access Now. I have with me Julia Noemy Gavarrete, who is a Salvadorian journalist specialized in political issues, violence and its impact on vulnerable communities. And in 2021, last year, she joined El Faro newsroom. And lastly, we have, and I'm sorry if I do not pronounce well your first name, Szabolcs Panyi, who is a journalist with an Hungarian non-profit investigative center, which is called Direct 36. And he mainly works on stories related to national security, corruption, and foreign policy. So to start this session, maybe I will let all our panelists to do a short introduction, not more than 4 minutes, to give their first thoughts about this call for a moratorium on digital surveillance technologies, but also on other pathways for accountability. So I will first give the floor to Likhita Barneji. Thank you for joining us online.
Yes, thank you, Renaud, for the introduction, and thank you also for co-organizing. Amnesty International is very happy to do this with the Office of the High Commission, and also really happy today to share space with all our co-panelists who are really experts at this issue. So by way of opening remarks, I think the theme of the conference and also the findings of the Pegasus project have sort of shown that it's pretty clear that we're talking about that the unchecked use of spyware is a serious threat to media freedoms around the world, to journalists, but also their sources, their networks of people, and often sometimes entire media houses are being put under surveillance. And so Amnesty International's mandate on this sort of comes from the lens of the international human rights law. And so starting with the basics, we know that the right to freedom of expression, right to privacy is enshrined in various human rights instruments. And we know that the state's current use and practice of unchecked deployment of tools like these, targeting journalists and human rights defenders solely because of their sort of human rights work is unambiguously illegal, unlawful under international human rights law. And it doesn't, in its current practice, fail to meet the tests laid out under international human rights law of the necessity, proportionality, legitimate aim that are the limits that are placed on surveillance. And so based on the findings of the Pegasus project, in which Amnesty International was a technical partner with a number of media houses, we have sort of observed that states in the world have not only failed in their obligations to protect human rights and defenders and journalists, but also failed in their own obligations to respect human rights by clearly letting these invasive spyware weapons loose on people worldwide for no other reason than exercising their human rights. Particularly, surveillance is a larger issue, but particularly on the use of Pegasus and other equivalent spyware. It's highly invasive in that it can do what the user can do a lot more. So the amount of data it has access to also does not have limits. So there is also an issue, arguably, of equivalent spyware like Pegasus violating privacy by design. And what we're observing in the Pegasus project and the year that has really been a snowball year of revelations is that the scale and breadth of these revelations are massive, and it proves wrong any claims by NSO group that their technologies are being used solely to fight crime and terror, or misuse is rare or anomalous. And what we've also observed is that sort of the targeting of journalists is happening regardless of the form of government. It's happening in democracies, and it's happening in otherwise repressive regimes. One thing that's really important that we've been observing in our history of work is that the evolving vector of attacks, from the earlier reports of wiretapping to phishing attempts to now SMS messages containing malicious links, and to more recently zero-click attacks, wherein there is very little one can do to protect oneself. So as technologies have evolved, so have the tactics of digital repression, and journalists are hence faced with new threats that are harder to protect against, harder to detect, and harder still to seek accountability for. And so really regulation is also failing at multiple levels, at the national, at the export control levels, and at the international level, with a lack of meaningful action. And so at this stage, civil society organizations and multiple other actors have noted that the only viable solution is a moratorium until regulatory efforts catch up. And hopefully we can discuss more today on what that looks like. And so I'll just end by saying that there is a specific culture of impunity specific to targeted digital surveillance that we need to sort of jointly, immediately counter. And we've seen that the use of this digital surveillance tools is completely out of control, destabilizing and threatening to individuals' human rights. Journalists and others have also sort of looked at multiple pathways of accountability, and other panelists will also weigh in on this. Some have worked more than others, and hopefully we can discuss what tactics have worked in the discussion that follows. And so the threat of spyware, I would say, it needs to be urgently countered, and the freedom of expression and the ability for journalists to work without fear and safety, and really the security of the digital ecosystem as a whole depends on our ability to counter it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Likhita. I think really in your presentation you point out that really there is no country immune of the use of technologies like Pegasus, but you also pointed out the importance of monitoring and campaign projects like the Pegasus project, and as well as the lack of regulation worldwide and the widespread impunity. Thank you for this first thoughts. I will now give the floor to Ángela Alarcón, with, as I said, working for Access Now. Ángela, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the invitation. Yes, I would like to start talking about the urgency of the moratorium. So journalists are in a very delicate position because they handle privileged information, but they do not count with the immunity or their privileges that other actors that has access to the same information might have. And sometimes they are working in very risky and undemocratic places while they are putting their names and their faces into the news that affect powerful people. This to say that the threats that spyware poses to journalists go beyond censoring them, and it is literally putting their lives at risk by sharing their locations, their ongoing investigations, the contacts, etc. So it is terribly harsh and sad, but to censor a journalist, the attacker can threaten them and can scare them, and they can try to block their work, because as many journalists around the world have shared, their sources, like including whistleblowers, have broke the relationship with the journalists after learning that they were being spied. But if nothing of that is enough, the attacker might ultimately be able to kill the messenger, and Pegasus offers a lot of useful information to do that in the place and manner that is useful to the attacker. Now, learning about being spied also creates a dark atmosphere of paranoia among journalists' guild, whether they have been confirmed of being a spy or not. And the resulting chilling effect can point to self-censor their journalistic work. There's an emotional, but also an economic cost for the journalists that learned that they were being spied, and they have to cope with buying new devices and internet plans, and generally to invest in privacy tools, which can impact even harder the independent media, who often do not have that many resources. So ultimately, the scope of the impact of softwares like Pegasus go beyond the infected journalists and the collected information. It is an intimidation method that changes the whole dynamic of the journalist and the media outlet where she or he works. So why is the moratorium important? Spywares imply a big intrusions in people's lives, and the tremendous impact in the victims' well-being, including, as I say, the chilling effect, infringe several articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I believe that one of the most obvious one is Article number 12 that refers to avoid the arbitrary interference on privacy, on family, on home, and correspondence. That is very much self-explanatory, but it also affects the freedom of opinion and expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, the freedom of movement, and the one that I believe kind of englobes the rest, the right to life, liberty, and security, because victims do not know what the attackers will do with information, and it is usual that they fear for their lives and the safety of their loved ones. So the moratorium is also important because a lot of the agreements between the governments and their companies are done in secrecy, and the opacity of the contracts and the processes pushes away any effort to audit and hold accountable the involved parts, not to mention that most of the countries do not count with a comprehensive legal framework. In that sense, well, civil society has and international organizations like the UN had referred in several occasions to the need of a moratorium. But just in March, Costa Rica became the first country in the world to request a moratorium. And it is very important that the countries follow this path. Regarding the human rights standard of a conditional moratorium, I think that we can talk about this later, but I think that agreed start point will be the 2019 report of the former Special Rapporteur David Kay on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ángela, for your first thoughts and for also reminding us that that surveillance technologies are really in violations of many human rights as enshrined in international human rights instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You mentioned indeed the right to privacy, as well as the freedom of expression, as well as other freedoms that are in these instruments. You also reminded us about the cost for journalists of the use of surveillance technologies like Pegasus, but not only for journalists, but also for their sources and also for their relatives. And talking about the cost, including, as you mentioned, the emotional cost for journalists, I'm now turning to Julia Gavarrete, who will talk about her experience in El Salvador. Thank you, Julia.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for having me here. I really feel really honor to talk about the case of El Salvador. And in terms of how do we feel being, monitoring and attacked by this kind of software, it's pretty hard to describe the impact that you as journalist, as a person, will have, because you feel vulnerable, you feel that someone is following your steps. And that's why when you asked me to participate in this panel, I was thinking about why this is so important to make an urgent moratorium in places, in countries like El Salvador, that after we published the story about 30 journalists being attacked by Pegasus, we don't have any information or any response from the government telling us, for example, who is the responsible or who is behind this surveillance. And as Ángela just mentioned, the problem is that we are very we have like a lot of concern about what's going on with our information, what's happening with our information, and who has it. So it's part of the impact that is not also that you feel like something really big just hit you. It's that you start thinking about your family, you start thinking about, do I have to, or question yourself, like, do I have to continue with this profession? Do I have to be in this situation? And well, just to give a little bit of perspective about what happened in El Salvador, we have probably for a long time this suspicious that someone was attacking us by maybe intervention or interception of our communications. But when we get in touch with Access Now and then with Citizen Lab, and they confirmed that we were that we have Pegasus in our phones, we have like enough evidence to say, so okay, there's someone here in El Salvador that is the responsible of this attack. So what do we have to do now is ask for the, to make the government and the authorities to be more responsible and to start like a serious investigation in all of that. But that's something that we didn't have until now. So that's why something that I want to mention also is that when we talk about surveillance, we had to make it clear that this is one of the most major attacks against individuals for, well, in this case, for raising their voice, like just happened in El Salvador, that activists and human rights defenders also were targeted with Pegasus. And in our specific case, well, 30 journalists that were in the same situation. So I think it's part of the feeling and the concern that we have right now in El Salvador.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this testimony, and really the testimony of the emotional impact of being targeted by technologies like Pegasus. But as you mentioned, also fear and stress, because you don't know what kind of information are that the people targeting you have in their hands, and you don't know also at the end who is really targeting you, even though you can have some suspicion about it. But this is really the stress causing by this unknown. So thank you for this testimony and for giving us a picture of what is going on in El Salvador. We'll come back, I'm sure, to this a bit later on. Now I'm giving the floor to another journalist who had been targeted by Pegasus. So again, sorry if I do not pronounce well your first name, Szabolcs Panyi, who is an Hungarian journalist working for the Center Direct 36. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity to speak about our case here in Hungary, and also why it's important for us that there's a moratorium on the sale of spyware. As you may all know, Hungary is a member of the European Union. And actually right now it seems that Hungary is among those 3 countries that are massively abusing Pegasus. Besides Spain and Poland, Hungary is the only other EU country so far as I understand, where the country's own government is surveilling its own citizens without real justification. I'm one of those journalists, one of those 5 or 6 journalists whom we identified as Pegasus victims, and there are also at least 3 media company owners who employ hundreds of journalists who've also been surveilled. It's pretty clear that this is an international issue and you cannot really tackle it in a local way. In the case of Hungary, the problem is that although this is an EU member state, the country's surveillance regulations and laws are not fully in line with the European Union standards. This means that if there are other European Union member state citizens coming to Hungary, they could also be surveilled in a way that would be impossible in their home countries, for example, in Germany or, I don't know, in the Netherlands by their own governments. This shows you that you cannot really tackle this issue on a local scale. And if I should mention my own case, I'm a journalist who's usually working on national security and foreign policy issues, which also means that some of my sources are not Hungarian nationals. They could be foreign government officials, they could be diplomats. And through my surveillance, also these foreign nationals were very likely affected, I'm sorry to say. So the problem is that you cannot really solve this issue by, I don't know, amending or restricting surveillance in Hungary, because this is not how our world works these days. The other problem here is that Hungary is not a fully democratic country anymore, although it's a member of the European Union. As I mentioned, our regulations are not fully in line with European Union standards. And the problem is that since the publication of the Pegasus project, we've seen basically zero credible evidence that the victims of this surveillance could find justice in the country. There have been multiple investigations launched in Hungary, one by our prosecutor's office. I myself was summoned in for an interrogation about what do I know about this case. Actually, the prosecutors seem to be more interested in what kind of information we have in this leaked database that Forbidden Stories obtained than about who the possible perpetrators could be behind this illegal surveillance. The Hungarian government was, for the first months, neither acknowledging nor denying that they are behind the surveillance. After a couple of months, when they saw that this story is not going to go away, they acknowledged that actually, yes, it's the Hungarian state that's surveilling journalists, but they claimed that every single surveillance has been permitted and there's a legal basis for the surveillance of journalists because we pose a threat to national security, for example. So the problem is that under this framework, you cannot really seek justice. There's just no way to stop, for example, the Hungarian government from surveilling journalists when they are almost proud of what they've done to us. Then there was another investigation by Hungary's Data Protection Authority, which ironically found that the Hungarian state did everything right, but they pressed for criminal charges because of the leak of this database, which contains the private phone numbers of Hungarian citizens. And the head of the Data Protection Authority alleged that it was basically Amnesty, Forbidden Stories, and its partners who could have been involved in a certain crime because we obtained or we had access to this database of phone numbers. So basically, this is how the victims became the bad guys here, according to the Hungarian state. And again, what I wanted to stress, this is just a case of a seemingly formerly European Union state. How can a journalist or how can any other victim find justice, for example, in less democratic countries, in countries that are not even members of the European Union? So I guess there's an argument here that you cannot really solve these issues locally. Also, there have been allegations that certain countries spy on victims on behalf of other countries, which means there's also a loophole here. One country can basically diplomatically, through intelligence sharing, ask another country to spy on, for example, journalists that are of interest to them. So that's why you cannot really patch this whole thing locally. We need a global solution to this. So that's why I'm really looking forward to this discussion to hear about possibly the practical side of how we can achieve that.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and also for pointing out that there is really a need for a global approach to this issue, and that in many cases it cannot be treated only locally. And you mentioned the need for a regulation at local level, but not only at local level, also at regional level, in your case at the level of the European Union, but also at international level. So I'm turning back to Likhita and Ángela afterwards to maybe give us a picture of this lack of regulation at international level. And then I will go back to Julia and Szabolcs. Sorry, really, if you can tell me your first name so I can pronounce it well, because every time I'm not sure I pronounce your first name rightfully.
Szabolcs is perfect.
Szabolcs. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry again. So I will turn back to you to have more the prospect of what is going on in El Salvador and also in Hungary. So I don't know, Likhita, if you want to react on this first, and then I will give the floor to Ángela.
Yes, thank you. I can make a few quick points. So I think what we've observed, and as Ángela rightly pointed out, one starting place for the analysis on the wholesale lack of global regulation is David Kaye, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression's 2019 report. And so also the findings have been sort of analyzed and separately by Amnesty. And what we're observing is that at the domestic level, there aren't any best practices or laws that are adequately safeguarding against surveillance, including by posing one, limits to it as enshrined under international human rights law, and two, by providing mechanisms of redress and remedy. Then when you come to the regional levels, at the export control levels, we have seen domestically and regionally as well, sort of countries failing to do adequate due diligence and failing to stop exports of such technologies where there is a substantial risk of human rights abuse. Israel's Ministry of Defense, for example, Amnesty International supported a case to revoke the export license, granted by the Ministry of Defense to NSO Group, and that sadly did not go through. And so the mechanism for accountability to check the lack of adequate export regulation mechanisms are also lacking. At the EU level, there's a new sort of dual-use recast rule that hopefully will provide more transparency on these issues as a starting step. But still, this has been lacking at the EU level as well for a number of years. And as Szabolcs rightly pointed out, internationally, there is a lack of leadership from states. There's a lack of action at multilateral forums in order to bring about moratorium and regulation. And so practically, when you're looking at the experience of a human rights defender, a journalist, as both Julia and Szabolcs have pointed out, there is a wholesale lack of any place where you can meaningfully go to have any form of justice. And so there are the solution that civil society organizations, in fact, more than 150 experts and organizations have supported the call for a moratorium in response to this failure of regulation at these multiple levels. Civil society organizations have also tried other mechanisms of accountability. And one is, of course, the example I gave on Amnesty supporting the case at the Israel on the Ministry of Defense, but there are others as well, which we can sort of also discuss.
Thank you, Likhita, for this global view. Maybe, Ángela, you want to complement what Likhita has said about this lack of regulation at international, regional, and local level?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, we have to be clear that when states are suspected to be involved in illegal espionage, a state investigation might be controversial or questionable, especially in those places where the separation of powers is weak. And taking that into account, to make any sort of accountability possible, it is important to have independent investigative bodies, to have access to an independent and impartial tribunal, as then again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if the local justice authorities can be trusted, an international tribunal should be the one to take the case. There is also, we're in a huge need of a binding legal framework in different countries, not to say all, and sanctions to company, not only for selling the products and the services that harm journalists and others, but also for hindering and denying access to information that will be valuable for the identification of the attackers. Another recommendation that has been previously said by the former special rapporteur is to create commissions of truth that allowed victims to display the testimony and the complicity of the companies in the crimes. But beyond the legal preparation and the search of justice, it is urgent that victims also receive psychosocial accompaniment to transit the emotional and the labor and the relationship impact of the surveillance. Because when the state might be involved in the espionage, it is not expected that the state will support the victims, or in any case that the victims will be willing to receive such support because they don't trust the state, of course. And in that sense, the work of civil society is crucial to help the containment of victims and to help them cover the extraordinary expenses that comes with learning that you have been spied, like from new devices to relocation to therapy and so on. Regarding the domestic and international safeguards, since the negotiations between the client and the seller are sometimes, or in most of the cases, possible due to intermediary companies that avoid the limitations of the Wassenaar arrangement, which in any case is not a non-binding agreement, some recommendations has been done to different authorities. For example, Access Now and several other organizations recommended to the European Commission to ensure the transparency of the exports, detailing per member state the number of applications received to each type of surveillance technology, the issuing member as well, and the destination concerned. We also recommended to detail the meaning of the terms around cyber surveillance technology and the continuous communications with civil society.
Thank you very much for these thoughts and for highlighting the need the need for regulation, but also on what we should regulate. You also mentioned the need for independent investigative bodies and investigation in general, and also the need, and this is something which is sometimes forgotten, for psychological support for the victims of spywares like Pegasus. I'm now turning back to Julia and then Szabolcs to have more their prospect on what is going on at national level, and especially in El Salvador and in Hungary, regarding this need for regulation. So what have you done, at the national level to advocate for more regulation? What was the response of the government? And also, what kind of legal avenues do you have at national level when you find yourself being targeted by spywares like Pegasus? So, Julia, if you want to start.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm going to divide my answer into ideas. First of all, yeah, we have very clear that in a local level, we are not going to have like any serious answer from the government. So we are working on some first steps that, well, we took with the Salvadoran Journalists Association, APES, who made a report to the Attorney General 2 days after we published the Pegasus story. This was just like a formal movement in the country, just to say we have like to register what's going on, but even if we know that we are not going to have any answers back from the government. After that, when we decide, well, after we were working with the CEGIL and the Due Process of Law Foundation, they help us to go to the Inter-American Commission to like a public audience. That was something that happens in last March. But at that moment, the government just said that, well, we said the government, but it was the prosecutor office that was acting like representing the government. They were acting, their role weren't like someone who is investigating. They were defending the government and the accusations about Pegasus. So they said that they were doing an exhaustive investigation, even when they didn't get, they said something like, oh, we don't have the names of the victims, and we were like, but the names of the victims are in the document that Citizen Lab and Access now also published. So what we realized by that time was that they weren't interested to find out who, or trying to at least give some details about what they were doing, because they weren't doing anything. So it's a shame that there's now serious response from El Salvador's government. And the other idea that I want to point out is that unfortunately, in El Salvador, the response that we have after the Pegasus case was the criminalization from the government. They criminalize the journalism right now. After many reforms that they, El Salvador's government sent to the Legislative Assembly that is controlled by the President Bukele political party, they approved many reforms that basically what these initiatives said is that they are going to create this figure of undercover digital agents that are going to be intercepted the communication. So this happens like a month after the Pegasus story. So for us, that was one of the answers back from the government. And right now, what we have is, well, we are in a state of emergency because of the violence. And this is like the perfect scenario in El Salvador to create more bills that basically are trying to silence our work. So this is like the huge picture, I think, that I can give about the real response from the government, unfortunately.
I don't know if it is a real response, but it is a kind of a response, or basically a lack of response of the government. But you also, and it was interesting in your intervention, you insisted on the role of that regional human rights instrument can play in addressing this issue. This is something that we will come back on a bit later. But no, I'm again turning to Szabolcs to have also his experience in Hungary about the reaction of the authorities to this need for more regulation, and also the pathways to accountability that exist or do not exist in Hungary, and even more as you were targeted by the Pegasus spyware. Thank you.
Yes, I already mentioned some examples of how the Hungarian government is not really taking this issue seriously, and why I don't really expect that there's going to be any change in the foreseeable future. What we are trying to do, although right now, is that with the help of international organizations like Reporters Without Borders, we've launched some legal action in France with the United Nations, with the help of the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, a prestigious local NGO. We are initiating legal procedures in Hungary, in the European Union, and with the help of Aitai Mak, an Israeli lawyer, we're also trying to file, or already filed, a complaint with the chief prosecutor of Israel. And we're also trying to go after NSO group in Israel. But to be honest, these legal actions are more about publicity. It's more about keeping the pressure on the governments, keeping the issue in the front line of public discourse. And it's really a long shot. So I don't really see, for example, any kind of chance for reparations or compensations in the individual cases of those who were surveilled. These legal actions that we are taking are aimed at trying to change the regulation on the local level, which is not very realistic. Second, trying to get a ruling from, for example, the European Court of Justice that Hungary's standards do not meet European Union standards when it comes to surveillance. And also we are trying to keep this issue afloat in Israel, because it was the Israeli Minister of Defense, as it was already said, that basically green-lighted the self-Pegasus to the Hungarian government, a government that has a very visible track record of cracking down on press freedom, and also a well-known record of loose regulations when it comes to surveillance. So since this is really a global story, we are trying to play each way. We are trying to take legal action wherever it's possible. But my impression is that it's going to be years of litigation before we see the very first results. I think that there are more effective ways for trying to tackle this issue, but it's really out of our hands. For example, sanctioning the company itself, like the United States has already sanctioned NSO, is a good way. We've seen that it had a tremendous effect on the financial possibilities of this company. It's basically going to get bankrupt, as far as I understand. So I'm, for example, really looking forward and really encouraging decision makers to not only sanction companies themselves, but also clients of NSO who are proven to be abusing this tool. The Magnitsky framework, the global Magnitsky sanctions could be, for example, a good example to be used against human rights abusers, because surveilling journalists, surveilling lawyers is also human rights abuse. And I guess there are also other kinds of ways how we can press for more accountability. And I just want to mention one more thing: somehow making big tech responsible and accountable for surveillance could also be a game changer. When I bought my iPhone, when I clicked on accepting the terms and the conditions, there was no section about me allowing Apple, for example, to let other third parties to surveil on me. So if we can make, for example, big tech interested in fighting the spyware industry, they are already doing that, of course. But if we can somehow threaten them, for example, with great accountability, maybe that will also push these tech companies to take the issue more seriously, to employ more experts who could patch all those holes that these spyware industry hackers are.
Thank you very much for these food for thoughts. and for also telling us about the legal actions that you have initiated in coordination with some NGOs and some other journalists. I'm now turning back to Likhita and also Ángela to know also what can more be done at international level and regional level in order to tackle this issue, and especially as it was mentioned both by Julia and Szabolcs, as how to use international human rights mechanisms, or as well as regional human rights mechanisms in this campaign against the use of digital surveillance technologies against journalists. Maybe Likhita, you can start, and Ángela, you can complement.
So I think on what more civil society and also regional and state mechanisms can do, a few ideas to sort of close my thoughts. I think an interesting case to learn from is the Amisas and Nexa Technologies case, which is a company which exported surveillance equipment to Egypt and Libya, and they were indicted then again for complicity for torture. So in this case, the link's been drawn to not just harm in terms of privacy and freedom of expression, but to more serious human rights violations, including torture. And so this is something that can be explored. On restrictive measures, I agree. I think a number of civil society organizations a few months ago, led by Human Rights Watch, called on the EU to take restrictive measures against NSO group. Certainly big tech companies have a role to play in increasing notifications where they see instances of abuse, and also bringing forth sort of litigation like we've seen Apple and WhatsApp cases, patching vulnerabilities, and also sort of sharing information with security researchers in order to be able to sort of detect these attacks. One thing that we have seen that doesn't work is to rely at all on the PR wash campaigns of companies like NSO, who say that the human rights policies and whistleblower policies will be able to sort of provide any form of redress and remedy. We're far past that point in the conversation to be able to trust them at their words. In terms of what regional and local, international human rights bodies can do, I think there's a clear demonstration by human rights defenders that we need to integrate technical, forensic, and digital security support, as well as psychosocial support in any regional and global human rights protection mechanisms at the UN or at the regional level, for example, at the EU, to provide a holistic package of support for human rights defenders, whilst recognizing that these are new threats that we need to be equipped to be able to deal with. At what states can do, follow the lead of Costa Rica to commit and demonstrate leadership and publicly commit to a moratorium. And then I think one of the immediate steps in the lead up to that is, if you're wondering what can we do immediately, is to really combat this culture of secrecy and transparency, sort of make procurement data public. This is important for civil society to be able to hold on to information about where surveillance transfers are happening, but also for security researchers to be able to sort of have leads and try to find indicators based on this information. And sort of want to end by saying that civil society intervention, currently there are a handful of organizations who are sort of investigating this technically. And this cannot be the only form of check against these companies. We cannot be left to be dealing with a multi-billion-dollar industry, and more sort of states and regional mechanisms need to be able to step up in order to combat them through technical and other investigations.
Thank you, Likhita. Many, again, foods for thoughts. And maybe, Ángela, you want to complement with some actions that could be initiated at international and regional levels?
Sure. I will like to quickly refer first to a couple of things that I believe that are currently working and not working. I believe that litigation is something that we should continue doing because investigations and lawsuits against companies not only damage their reputation, it also impacts their pocket, as we recently saw with the closing of the German spyware firm Fischer, who just weeks ago declared themselves in bankruptcy. And also to constantly be vocal about the cases, to keep it fresh in everyone's agendas, because the justice path for this kind of cases can be long. And unfortunately, there are thousands of digital threats and human rights threats that also require time and resources and connections. So continuing the independent investigations and connecting with other victims in the world and publicly speaking about any backs and forths in the processes help to keep the fight alive. Now, on the other hand, what definitely I believe does not work if that, well, after last year's scandal with the Pegasus projects, the Defense Ministry of Israel has been banning the sales of cyber technology to certain countries with questionable human rights records. Yet their list has become shorter, not longer. And in any case, any country can be using the spyware in unlawful activities, including those who are recognized as democracies. And Israel has also said that the countries that acquire such technology will be required to sign a declaration that it is only for the investigation and prevention of terrorist acts or serious crimes. So such action, I believe, is more likely to secure Israel from lawsuits than to actually protect human rights defenders and journalists and other victims. In any case, what is important is that other countries place companies like NSO Group in their trade blacklist. The United States did so with NSO Group in November of last year. And the reason was that the company acted contrary to the foreign policy and national security interest of the US. Asking for the cooperation of the state where the spyware company is based, I believe is also a must in an investigation. Yet it will hardly lead to somewhere in the case of Pegasus and Israel. There's actually an Israeli human rights lawyer, Etai Mak, that told Reuters that up to his knowledge, Israel has never cooperated with a defense export probe outside its own borders. So that it will give you an idea of what to expect. And finally, I believe that something that needs to be looked into very carefully is the willingness of companies like NSO to align with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. As it was recently disclosed by The Guardian, NSO allegedly hired a person to do so at some point, only to later deny the accusations of knowing how Pegasus was being used for human rights violation, to reject piles of well-documented evidence, and to show in general lack of cooperation in the investigations. Now, moving to what more needs to be done, it is pretty clear that the position of the organizations that stand with human rights is regarding this issue, but we need that the states commit to. And I agree with Likhita that's why the Costa Rican call for a moratorium is so important. And I urge Costa Rica to effectively implement it because it is necessary that the moratorium becomes a snowball effect among states, and it has to start somewhere. The states who have been proved to spy on their citizens will hardly, of course, move their hands around this, but other countries can prevent the problem to become bigger. Mexico's targets of Pegasus go all the way back to 2016. Now imagine if a state had reacted then with a spyware moratorium, how many human rights catastrophes could have been avoided? And with this dangerous technology around, anyone can be spied, even government officials in countries that are considered democratic.
Thank you very much. Since we have some minutes left, I don't know if Julia and Szabolcs would like to complement what Likhita and Ángela said. If you really want to give us also some advocacy messages and also some food for thoughts for more action to tackle this very prominent issue.
Yeah, thanks. When we talk about Pegasus and surveillance, which in El Salvador, it's a shame that we just received a lot of attacks and from anonymous accounts in social media, and also from government's officials. So what I think it's very necessary right now is that El Salvador's government can stop this hostile and systematic campaign that is activated every time that we said something related with surveillance or with accountability or maybe the investigations that we are doing as journalists. But what we really need more, I think, is that will be great if states as El Salvador stop creating these bills that criminalize journalism and particularly legalize the state surveillance.
Thank you. Maybe Szabolcs, you want also to say something really and to leave us some advocacy message.
Well, it would be unfortunate if I spoke less because I don't have any optimistic messages here. What I still wanted to stress is that, for example, the Pegasus project has been a really great collaboration of journalists from dozens of countries with experts. And I think that what we need to continue in order to keep on the pressure on governments and also on international institutions to regulate and to sanction the use of the abuse of such spywares as Pegasus, is to keep on cooperating, having similar panels, talk about the issue, go out and speak about our experiences to the masses, give as many interviews as possible, and try to keep the topic afloat. There are many horrible things happening around the world, but the thing is that the Pegasus story has shown us, I believe, and this is not an optimistic message, I know. It has shown us how the future will look like, or what kind of direction we're going into. We've been investigating the abuse of a couple of hundreds of thousands of people, but if this story continues as it is sadly expected, then there could be many more people, millions, masses, tens of millions of people with the same fate that they could be surveilled on by their own governments if we let this continue. So just try to keep on what we've been doing.
Yes, but this is optimistic to keep on, and I think you pointed out right, and this will be my concluding remarks: the need for cooperation at international, regional, and as you mentioned, as Julia also mentioned. This problem cannot be tackled only at local level, and there is really a need for more coalitions, more cooperation. And I hope this today's session that we jointly organize with Amnesty International will help to build more synergies between the United Nations, between NGOs, and between, more importantly, journalists and journalists association. And as it was said, really a first step is really to join this call for a moratorium. What, as it was also mentioned, Costa Rica did, and more member states have to join this call. As for OHCHR, we will continue to repeat this call and try to work more closely with NGOs and journalists on the ground. So thank you very much for having participated to this session. Thank you, Likhita, because we organized together this session. So it was a pleasure to organize it with you, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Julia, for being with us here in Punta del Este, and thank you, Ángela and Szabolcs, for joining online this session. So goodbye, and hopefully we will have other session to reflect on this.